Hey, what's going on? So, this is going to be part two of this review here, right? I forgot to airdrop myself March campaign one. So, literally picking up right where we left off with the last video. Here we go. So, yeah, starting at 317 here. Try and make this like that. There we go. Right, 317. Started that campaign. Either way, same thing, right? We'll just continue. So, negative 2,500 on this Chinese team to hold a 7 point lead with 3:10 in the fourth. At 6:30 with 2:08 remaining, the money line closed with a 112.99 lead. So pretty fascinating as its own observation within the bet. Those 3 minutes where they essentially like stretch the lead. You know, they score 6 points in like 3 minutes. On to the next bet. Tennis. Negative 5,000 on Prismic to win the second set. Potentially, as its own data collection, like who's the opponent, building out these profiles. Won the first set 6-1 up 2-0. Add 40 when I place the bet. It goes up 3-0 after the bet. 3 minutes later, right, 637 to 640. At 640 goes up 30-0. Odds shot up to negative 1,500. I should probably say negative 15,000, right? Bet 3. Negative 2,000 on Carlos Hover to win the third set. Won the first set 6-2. Lost second set 2-6 up 30-0 5-3 in the third when I pulled the trigger. So again, like another way that this like that a tennis win could present itself. So we see that. I think this is like the first example of a third set that we see. See a third set, right? But like most of the ones before this that we've covered have been the second set. So pretty fascinating. Bet 4 here, negative 5,000 on, Kovalik to say however you say that, to win the second set. Won first set 7-5, up 5-3, but down 30-40 when I pulled the trigger. Very fascinating as its own situation. Obviously, he's like very favored though, because the money line is so, the return on capital is so low here. So that is its own situation, right? Even though he's like down in the game, and and then that could potentially, if he loses this game, that could potentially lead to like he only has a 1 point or a 1 game lead, potentially a 5-4, right? That's why it's even offered in the first place. Like this is pretty much a sure thing for this guy already. He's obviously very favored. It's like seeing this situation as its own opportunity, right? Because then he, like what really happened though, because this was a 4 minute bet, he makes it deuce and then he wins the game. So pretty fascinating, right? Those little mini situations. Bet 5 here, negative 10,000 on Claire Liu to win the first set 7. She won the first set 7-6, up 5-2, but 15 all when I pulled the trigger. 6 minutes later, right, we entered the bet at 10:02. Now at 10:08, 5-3, odds drop to negative 3,000 at 15 all. So very fascinating. Hit it at 15 all, 5-2. When it was 5-3, the opponent won that game down to 3,000. So like that is its own opportunity within. Like this lady's obviously going to win, but like on the way to um, that result, what are those like opportunities where the opponent fights back and then the odds drop significantly as its own entry, right? You could put in additional cash and get that 3% return, right? Versus this is what like not a 3% return, right? I can't do the math. I don't really know. Or like a 1% return potentially, right? If that. So on to the bet 6 here. Negative 5,000 on Tristan Boyer to win. Won first set 6-3, lost second up 4-1, 30-15 in the third when I pulled the trigger. Again, a 4 minute bet. Very nice. On to the next bet. 11:39 to 11:42. Negative 1,400 on Darwin Blanche. Won the second set 6-0, up 5-3 when I pulled the trigger. So again, that, third set situation there. Must have lost the first set, absolutely dominated in the second set. Is looking like he's going to close it out in the third set. Bet 8 here. Negative 5,000 on Grietmann and to win. Won the first set 6-2, up 3-2, and I pulled the trigger. She's heavily favored in the books, and that's basically why I pulled the trigger here. You'll see, though, it's very fascinating. It ends up being a 40-minute bet, and it ends up being kind of a struggle for her to pull it out. So, again, though, depending on your conviction, this could be entry opportunities. So, 3-3, right? Well, okay, we'll just kind of read this as I go through, right? Enter the bet at 12-3, 3 minutes later, right? 3-3 down to negative 1,200 as she's down 0.15, down 1,100, down 30, down 900, down 0.40, right? So she like just gets kind of whooped this game. That could be its own opportunity. 12-10, she's up 15-0. Then the odds go from negative 1,100, even though down 3-4 in the set. 12-20, she ties it up 5-5 up to 1,100. 12-26 down 5-6, up 15-0, down to 700. So that is its own situation as well, right? Like almost, loses. But not necessarily like, because this is the second set here, right? And so it's like she's still, or is this the second set? Yeah, this is the second set, right? And so it's like the second set could just be like she's going to work, right? We've seen multiple examples of where they basically just, wrap it up quickly. And here it's like we see the opponent basically like, fighting tooth and nail to stay alive, and then Grietmann closes it out, right? So we could still see the win. We could still see the money line bet, despite it, taking longer than anticipated. So 317 here. Next bet, negative 1,200 on FC Bazao to hold the 2-1 lead. Pulled the trigger at the 89th minute after watching odds rise from negative 600 to negative 1,200. So again, that 5-minute bet, very nice activity. Bet 10. Negative 20,000 on this team to hold their multi-point lead at the 69th. So again, we already did one of those earlier. Right up here, right? Multi-point lead, earlier in the game, essentially. Same thing, right? This is a very high probability, which is why I pulled the trigger, right? So, I potentially would be willing to sit in that for that high probability. Bet 11 here, negative 10,000 on Rebecca Masarova to win the tiebreaker. So again, kind of a sure thing here. Is it, is that 1 minute worth the, like 1% return essentially? Bet 12, negative 2,500, right? Pull the trigger at the 89th after watching the odds rise from negative 1,200 to negative 2,500. So again, those odds rising. Bet 13 here, negative 10,000. Quick bet, right? Bet 14 here, negative 575 on this draw. Pulled the trigger at the 90th after watching the odds rise from negative 500 to negative 575. So, it's sort of like a marginal rise in odds. There's been, I remember earlier in the video I was talking about, or maybe even, in the part one of this part three, if you will. But it was like a negative 500 to negative 550 odds rise, if you will. And then like, AKA return on capital going down, right? So that's not really like that much of a rise or that much of a decrease in return on capital. And neither is the, 500 to 575. So like that is its own potential situation as well, right? So really just being able to measure the offering. 318. Next day, right? Negative 1,100 on Maestrelli to win the third set. Lost the first set 4-6, won the second set 6-3, up 4-1, 40, or 40, or yeah, up 4-1 at deuce. when I pulled the trigger. From 628 to 630, right? 2 minutes. Up 4-2, money line drops to negative 475. So he's up 4-1, ends up obviously like losing the deuce here. So all the way from negative 1100 to negative 475, potentially its own opportunity, up 4-2, 40-40, money line negative 500. Now he's up 5-2, up 2000, up 5-3, money line at negative 900, up 5-3, down 30, money line all the way down to negative 300. Up 5-4, money line at 165. At 643, when did the bet end? At 647. From 643 to 647 is 4 minutes. He closes out that final game in 4 minutes after this absolute drop in the odds, aka rise in potential return on capital. And so, we see that as well in these like what happened intra game, right? We had that essentially 10% return. I'm satisfied with something like that. But if it could basically, in theory, as it's like dropped all the way from negative 1100 to negative 165. I think that's like basically like a 90% return on capital if I'm thinking about it correctly. Um, so like potentially hitting this with like a fraction of whatever you just, put on the, like parental bet, if you will. So it's very fascinating again to like know what happened as the time goes on, the way that the game is situated, and then the way that the book odds are reflected or situated within all of that. So next bet here, bet 16. Negative 1200 on Coutinho to win the second bet. On the first bet, 6-3, up 5-3, 15 all when I pulled the trigger. Up 5-3, down 30-40. The money line goes all, it basically halves, right? Goes down to negative 650. Ends up losing that game up 5-4, money line at negative 400. Up 5-4, 30-0. Money line just begins to run away, right? So that is its own situation. Like to go from like a five, like you've already won 5 games, to go to that sixth game is like such lower pressure than like as the opponent having to like climb all the way back. And on top of that, like, them already being favored. So pretty fascinating. Bet 17 here. Negative 2,500 on Sharankova to win the third set. Won the second set 6-1, up 5-3, 30-0 when I pulled the trigger. And so she's up 5. She's like 2 moves away from winning the game. And the odds are still reasonable, man. That's a reasonable return, for a money line bet on the favored player. So that's pretty fascinating, right? Next day here, 319, negative 3,500 on this Greek team to win. Pulled the trigger. 4 minutes left in the third after watching the odds rise. From negative 2,800 to negative 3,500 with a 14-point lead. It's okay. We've talked about this sort of like 10-point lead idea. What happens like after that 10? If it's the second half and this other team is dominating, like, is that is that something you'd be willing to engage in potentially, or do you want to wait for the fourth quarter no matter what, right? We engage at 8:40. 10 minutes later at 8:50, the fourth quarter starts. They have an 11-point lead, so this 14-point lead has dropped to an 11-point lead, but it's still above that 10-point lead. And so it's like that whole situation. Obviously, I don't know what the money line is here. It might not have even been offered, et cetera. But 10 minutes later from that, at 9 o'clock, they have a 10-point lead with 4 minutes left in the game, and the money line isn't even offered. So, right, if you're looking for that 10-point lead in the fourth, it might not even be offered. So that is its own, situation. And I'm curious, what was the money line even offered at the beginning of the fourth? So, obviously I didn't like write any of that, but pretty fascinating. Next bet here, next day, right? 320, negative 6,000 on the 4-2 lead here. So up 4-2 at the 70th, pulled the trigger after watching odds rise from negative 3,500 to negative 6,000. On to the next bet, right? Bet 20, negative 2,500 on, however you say this name. Won the first set, 6-7, up 5-4, 40-0 in the third when I pulled the fourth after watching the odds rise. 1 minute bet, very nice. The fact that it's even offered, literally one move away from winning the game, right? That like quick return, that like quick return on that capital, to me, that's worth it. Bet 21, negative 2,800 on Vitis to win. Pulled the trigger with 15 minutes left in the third after watching the odds rise from negative 2,500 to negative 2,800 with a 16-point lead. Obviously, this ends up being like, a longer game here. 10 minutes later, essentially, right? 9:24 to 9:34. That 16-point lead has dropped to a 10-point lead. The start of the fourth, money line has also, essentially like dropped like, 60% down to negative 650. 10 minutes from that, 65, 57-point game. 5 minutes left in the fourth, money line at negative 950 to go to negative 1,300 with a 68-59 lead with 440 left as I write this. It's like from here to here, right? And then, from like here, from that 65, 57-point game to that 68, 59-point game, that 9-point lead with 40 left up to that negative 1,300. So very fascinating. All that occurring after we engage. 10 minutes after that, right? 71, 68-point game, a 3-point lead with 143 left in the fourth. Money line at negative 310, right? And so, like, from here to here, they take that 3-point lead and double it up to 6 with 25 seconds left in the fourth quarter as the money line closes up to that 6-point lead still with 8 left in the fourth. So very fascinating, right? Just like all the activity that happens within this, like in these 7 minutes or so, the way that the game like really stretches out. And obviously, like they still score like a lot. Like the obviously there's like most of this is probably free throws and stuff, but there's obviously like some threes and stuff going on in the game. So that is its own situation, its own way to approach basketball. Yeah. So that's like, the end of that. We'll go to here we go. Essentially just continuing the campaign, right? Next day here, 321 capital, right? And so we see that. Bet one here, negative 6,000. They're up 2-0 at the 72nd minute when I pulled the trigger, right? On to the next one, negative 1,200, St. George City to win, up 1-0. Pulled the trigger at the 85th minute after watching the odds rise from negative 1,000 to negative 1,200. Next one here, negative 2,000 on, this team to win. They're up 2-0 at the 72nd minute after watching the odds rise from negative 1,800 to negative 2,000. Just checking on, like, okay, putting in the bet at 107, 6 minutes later or so, looking at the money line again. Money line is at negative 6,000 at the 80th minute. And so, like, relatively from negative 1,200 to negative, or excuse me, from negative 1,800 to negative 6,000, like whatever that is, how can you get in at like the first half of that odds rise? Like that's the ideal, really. That's all you can ask for. You can't really demand perfection. Bet 4 here, negative 20,000 on Everton, up 2-0 at the 75th minute when I pulled the trigger after entering. The money line became unavailable. It's like within those 20 minutes, like this wasn't even offered anymore. But like on the way to this, to this negative 20,000. It was obviously offered before. So, yeah, pretty interesting. Bet 5 here, negative 2,000 on Strom God set to win. 2-1, pulled the trigger at the 86th after watching odds rise from negative 1,200 to negative 2,000. So, yeah, pretty fascinating. Entered at 9:13. 2 minutes later, at 9:15, the money line was at negative 5,000 at the 90th minute. So pretty fascinating, right? Again, like from negative 2,000 to negative 5,000. Yeah. Bet 6 here, negative 1,400 on a draw. 2-2, pulled the trigger at the 92nd minute after watching odds rise from negative 1,200 to negative 1,400. Bet 7 here, another draw, negative 1,800 on a draw, right? 2-2 draw, pulled the trigger at the 92nd minute after watching the odds rise from negative 1,200 to negative 1,800. So literally the same, pretty close to the same situation here, right? Next day, 323. Tennis, negative 5,000 on Evans U to win. Won the first set, 6-4, lost the second, up 5-0, 15-0 when I pulled the trigger. So pretty fascinating. Bet 9, negative 4,000 on Turkey to win. Up 2-0, pulled the trigger at the 72nd minute after watching the odds rise from negative 2,500 to negative 4,000. Interesting observation here between bet 8 and 9. I was watching the Finnish Cup money line. It was 3-2, and I was considering hitting the money line in favor of the leader at the 89th minute. The money line was low, negative 575, and in hindsight, I was conscious of the feeling. I was conscious of the feeling of not fully trusting the bet. After watching this, the score became 3-3. After this, it was around the 92nd minute when the previous lagger went up 4-3 after a negative 700 money line on a draw. And so, well, okay, I'll just finish. In summary, this was the second premonition I've had, gut feeling, if you will, of a late game score change. The first one happened in March campaign 1. So we already talked about that. We already addressed that, but pretty fascinating as well, right? Like, okay, it was 3-2. I would potentially hit that situation. Essentially because it's like Finnish Cup. Like, that's like major soccer, However, though, if it's major soccer and it's kind of a guaranteed win, then like wouldn't the odds be higher than negative 575? But at the same time, too, I've hit odds that low. And so, there's like all those things to consider within that, right? And so after passing up on that bet, it became 3-3. And then so simultaneously, I've presented multiple examples of engaging the draw, right? And so like if it's 3-3, okay, they just scored. It's very unlikely that like anything else is going to happen in the game. Like something late game already happened. Some like crazy thing already happened. What are the odds that a secondary crazy thing is going to happen, right? And so very fascinating. And just to like write this, kind of an interesting little data point to have here. But, 3-3 potentially could have been that negative 700 engagement. And so, yeah, very fascinating, man. Either way, that's the end of that activity, right? Withdrew it there. And then we go into essentially April campaign 1, which begins on the final day of March here. And so after we withdrew that capital, we then put, this capital, essentially like what we started with in the previous campaign, we put it back in, if that makes sense. First bet here, negative 2,000. Up 1-0, pulled the trigger at the 87th after watching the odds rise, right? New month, right? Same campaign, though, right? Same campaign. Sophia Kenin to win the second set, won the first set 6-3 up 4-0 when I pulled the trigger. 4-1, 15-15 money line down to negative 5,000. 4-1, 15-30 money line down to 3,000. 4-2 money line at negative 2,000. 4-3 money line at negative 900. 10-40, 5-3 money line at negative 3,000. 5-4 money line at negative 2,000. 30-30 money line at negative 2,000. Add 40 money line at negative 5,000. And so it's like on the way, like on the way to that, like, okay, like they could potentially make it a 2-set game and like on paper dominate, but like the on the way to that second set win, there could be this struggle, right? We could see, and you could see it simply as the opportunity, right? There's like these, from 10:30 to 10:50, there's like 20 minutes of potential scale in opportunities in this bet, right? Bet 3 here, negative 2,000 on Colchetti Potty to win, up 1-0 at the 89th minute. Pulled the trigger after watching the odds rise from negative 1,400 to negative 2,000. 2 minutes later, the money line is at negative 6,000 at the 92nd minute. Bet 4 here on Houston to win. End up cashing this out manually, actually. Lost first set 3-6, won second set 6-4, up 4-2, 40-15 when I pulled the trigger. Pulled the trigger at 11:08. 6 minutes later, it's 5-2, 40 ad. Money line at negative 3,500. At 11:15, 5-3, money line at negative 2,500. And I cashed out, right? At 11:27. And then he ends up winning. And so, that in and of itself was obviously like frustrating, but at the same time too, it's a very fascinating study, man. It's a fascinating study as far as the way that like the game fluctuates on the way to the win, and it's fascinating that this still ends up being a win. And simultaneously, it's really something to consider as far as like the cash out feature. Do you even want to engage in the cash out feature? Simultaneously, are you just willing to preserve capital? Right at the end of the day, that was really where my head was at. So I think being able to handle that professionally is important. And simultaneously, I think the best thing to do is like take a break, literally just like put some time into not taking activity, especially after going like, as hard as we did in March, right? Like from 317 to like 330, right? Like those final 2 weeks of March, and then looking to continue that for April. Wasn't even really looking to continue that for April, but like that, like continuing that momentum, if you will, receiving this result instead of trying to immediately like fix this, if you will, or seeing it as a problem to fix. Like in my mind, this loss, the fact that the capital basically just halved, like that's not really something to fix. It doesn't have to be immediately made back, right? So either way, that's where my psychology is at, right? When I'm experiencing that. On to July here. Obviously after experiencing that here, what do we do practically? We drop the capital, right? Instead of risking that 1,500, we're down to 250. And so like, just like literally like significantly dropping it, right? Negative 450 on Poland women's team to hold the 3-2 lead. Pulled the trigger at the 86th minute after watching the odds rise from negative 425 to negative 450. As I write, odds are at negative 600. So again, sort of like a uncertain situation here. The odds are this low with this result in a major game, late game. Who knows what's going on the field, right? Kind of fascinating. So either way, this bet pans out, then it basically looked to like immediately rotate it, right, into this game. Negative 3,500 on Rosario to hold the 1-0 lead. Pull the trigger at the 88th after watching the odds rise from negative 3,000, negative 3,500. As I write, odds are now at negative 500, or negative 5,000, excuse me. And then it ends up being a tie late game. And so, even though we've hit this situation with extreme accuracy, like this late game soccer situation, obviously there's examples of it not panning out. Obviously there's examples of the tennis situation not panning out, right? There's examples of these things panning out. And so it's like, how do you structure risk within that as well, right? How do you like reduce risk anticipating these types of situations? That's really something I can appreciate, right? So yeah, like what do you do after the late March or early April, late March situation, that loss? And then what do you do after that July loss? You continue to drop the risk, man. And that's exactly what we do here. So, now we've dropped the risk $100, right? Capital at, 150. And, only taking a handful of bets here as well. So again, right? Negative 15,000 on the Scranton Penguins to hold the 3-1 lead against the Phantoms. Pulled the trigger at around 5 minutes left in the third period of the hockey game. As I write, this money line was up to negative 20,000 at 3:30. Money line no longer available. So the way that that money line runs up could also be applicable to hockey. Pretty solid here as well, right? Only like a 5 minute. It's actually incorrect here. All There we go. Yeah, either way, pretty fascinating, right? Bet two, negative 2,500 on the 76ers to win with that 10-point lead, 11 minutes left in the fourth. I was going to hit it at the negative 21 money line, then it rose to negative 2,500. So that is its own situation as well, like seeing the rising there. And then, kind of got experimental, I suppose you could say. I've been considering this as well, like within basketball, essentially like betting on individual player performance. Um, and so, yeah, man, I mean, this was sort of an experimental bet. I was confident taking this, and obviously it ends up as a loss. Negative 900 bet on LeBron to score at least 15 points during the Lakers versus Mav games, and I pulled this at 9 minutes in the fourth quarter, and he currently had only 2 points. So that's it's kind of like potentially its own situation or its own bet. Um, but yeah, man, final bet of the year here. Final notes of the review. Um, Not a whole lot else to say. I might even make like a final video, just like purely talking about stats and data and stuff like that. But I think it's gonna do it for this one. Peace.